This isn't about what makes fishing interesting. That's going to be a whole other thing. But it's what makes a fish in Final Fantasy XIV interesting. Why do you have folks like me saying, oh, this fish is great, this is interesting, and others not? Like, what actually makes up an interesting fish? So, I want to talk about that for a little bit because it's a similar conversation that you can have about talking about like a trial or a raid or a dungeon. And the only difference is when you talk about it in the context of a fish, people give you really funny looks because people don't think that fish are have facets of interesting features, things that make them interesting. Everyone thinks it's kind of like, oh, it's just a fish. Like, what makes it fun and interesting? So, I kind of want to talk about that a little bit. So, the first thing we want to look at is the fish design, and for those who don't fish or maybe don't fully kind of get where I'm coming from with this so far, I want you to think about fish sort of as like a boss in a trial or in a raid or something like that. Like those bosses have mechanics, they have things about them that people find interesting or they find enjoyable or intriguing, something that tests their ability to play their combat class, something like that. Fish are kind of similar in that. When you look at like specifically big fish, I should specify that I'm talking about big fish. There's a lot of different facets to a big fish and the environment that the big fish is in that can make it fun and interesting. The first one, and I've talked about this before, is the bait choice because bait impacts a lot of different things about a fish. It impacts how quickly or not quickly it's going to bite. Not just the one fish we're going after, but all of the fish in the fishing hole. Each bait has different timings. So, like a harbor herring on Pillbug is going to have a different bite time, the window in which that it could bite, than on Versatile or on Lugworm. It's going to have a different bite rate as well. That's why you see with some fish, if you're just, catching the fish just for log completion, like a common fish for log completion, we may say, yeah, just use like leech. But if you're going for a big fish that requires mooching, that common tier fish, or it's part of an intuition, we're going to recommend a different bait because it's more effective and it's more worth it to use when you're going for the big fish. So, bait choice can really be like a ground bait. Well, I should say bait choice and the fishing hole itself are kind of like the ground floor of the like the basis of what makes a fish interesting. And if you have a bait that has a lot of fish that could bite on it and you're going for like a big fish specifically, then having a big fish that shares, a like a bite type or even like a hook set. So precision or powerful, that's something that we've been talking about with Dawn Trail fishing a lot now with the addition of the level 100 skills, the Ambitious Modest Lair. You have to start thinking differently. Like, okay, well, I'm on this bait. There's 5 other fish that could bite. Well, if I had to fish on, say, another bait, it could have only been 2 or 3 fish. And that's going to change what I slap. That's going to change if I use lure or not. That could change the bite rate even. And so when we talk about baits, that is, again, like I said in another video, and you'll find that in the description, baits are a very important part of like the basis of what makes a fish interesting. Because not because like, oh, we don't want to use the same bait over and over again, but because there can be a lot of interesting situations where bait and the fish that you need to catch can start interacting. And I'll talk about those. I have examples in a little bit, so bear with me on this. I have to kind of lay some groundwork. The fishing hole itself as well can be interesting and impact how we go for big fish as well. So if you look at a fishing hole that maybe has only 3 fish, one of them is a big fish, likely or not, you're just going to slap one of them and that'll be it. Mural's Tier in the Raktika Great Woods with Golden Pipira is a very good example of this, where Golden Pipira, not a super interesting fish, but it is the only powerful hook set in the whole fishing hole. It's the only powerful hook set fish, and 3 other very dominating weak bites are its accompaniment on the bait that it is caught on, which is rubber ball. So when you have a fishing hole like that, it's very clear cut. It's like, oh, okay, you have one powerful hook set, there's a set strategy for that. But if you compare that to a fishing hole like the Ruby Price, which is where you catch Cure, or even Peaks Poga, where you can catch Punity Pain, which is a new fish in 7.4, there's a lot of other overlaps with different bite types. You have to be more aware of what the timings are of all the different fish because they overlap on the different baits. And so if there's a little bit more involvement with the other fish, like how much am I going to have to pay attention to the other fish in the fishing hole is probably the easiest way to put this now that I'm kind of rambling this out. It can impact how much you have to engage with that fish, and thus, in having more engagement, this is going to be a common theme of being engaged. How much engagement you have with the fish can really impact its level of interest. And I touched on it briefly as well. The other thing that kind of ties into the fishing hole itself and the baits is also the bite time. I mentioned that before. If you have a fish that's a very long bite, like Soul of the Martyr, Deepon, Amply Caltrop, Henotus Grandis, those can have different approaches. And if you have a really short bite, especially now in Dawn Trail, we can use lures to reroll. So we can effectively we can cast out, wait a certain amount of time, and if it's a short bite for that fish that we want, like say a big fish that we're going for, if we pass that time, we can use the lure and get another chance at that fish because of just how the lures work. Fish like bombard fish, steel razor. Steel razor is actually a really good example because it bites at a fixed time. It's like 6-7 seconds. If you don't have a bite by 7 seconds, you use Modest Lure, you re-roll, and you wait 5 seconds. You have just saved yourself a few seconds per cast, which means you're going to get more casts per window, which means you have a higher chance of catching the fish in the window. Like, that's interesting. Compared to if Steel Razor was just the longest bite, then it's just going to be slap chum and hope for the best. Not as interesting, but get to more specific examples in a bit. You'll notice though that I haven't talked about like I've talked about skills a little bit, but I haven't been like any sort of other mechanics around fishing because it's all just the design of that one specific fish can do a lot of heavy lifting for if it's going to be interesting or not, or the fishing hole itself. One of the things that I've talked about with Dawn Trail fishing holes that I think is interesting, but not in a good way, is most of them are balanced based on the hook set. So I should say there's maybe a fishing hole that has, say, 6 fish. 3 of them are precision hook set, 3 of them are powerful hook set. That's leads to some kind of like repetitiveness, so it really isn't as interesting because like once you figure out how to deal with a balanced hook set fishing hole, you pretty much have that strategy for all the other fish, and that's a lot of fish. We see that with some fish where if you just slap one, use a lure, you get the other one like almost immediately. Uh, It's interesting, but it's not interesting if that makes sense. I know I'm definitely rambling here, but I'm building up to a thing here. So it's there's a lot of heavy lifting that can be done in making a fish interesting before you actually even look at the fish itself. Like how you have to catch the fish with intuition, and does it require mooch? What's its personality? Something else that we talk about with fish is their personality. So when we talk about personality, we're talking about stuff like uh, how slippery is it? How rare is it? What's the combination of that? And usually, if you have a very slippery fish, it's going to be usually more common than if you have a rare fish that isn't going to be as slippery. So a fish like the second one, which is this like usually top 3 rarest fish in the game, called the blue window in uh, Sea of Clouds, right next to Mukugul Isle and Oak Zandu, the eighth right there. Uh, It's a very rare biting fish, but it's not super slippery. They do add a balance to this. So they add a balance of like if it's going to be super rare, it's not going to be as slippery. There's one exception to this, and I'll get to that. And if it's super slippery, like say brown banana eel, it isn't going to be uh, super duper rare. Like you're not going to be having to wait windows before a bite actually happens and then only to have it slip. There are exceptions to this, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But those are just some other facets of fish that can be manipulated to make them interesting. Now, when we start looking at skills itself, I already touched on using lures to reroll. I kind of got ahead of myself there, but we can use lures to reroll. That's one thing. But with the introduction of the lures in Dawntrail, we also got hidden fish. So if you look at the ambitious and modest lure descriptions, it says sometimes can attract like a rare species of fish. This is talking about those types of fish. The community, at least the English speaking community, call them hidden fish because they have to be revealed in order to bite using ambitious and modest lure. That's not really an official name, but if you hear me refer to it as hidden fish, that's what I'm talking about. Fish like Zogar Condor, Harlequin Queen, Datniodes aeroplanos, those are all hidden fish that have to have a special proc from using lure in order to actually have a chance to bite. In the same vein, we have Fisher's Intuition. This is another thing that can be added to a fish to make it interesting, and I'll put this all together. I promise. I have to lay out all the pieces first. But intuition is another thing that we can use to judge how interesting a fish is, and not only can we use that, we can also see how long is the window. How long is the buff? How long is the window that the buff is in? So shorter intuitions versus long intuitions versus long windows or short windows. Windows being the like real world time or the in world time, excuse me, that it's actually available like 2 a.m. to 5 a.m. And the play between, am I only going to have to get intuition once and then it covers me through the entire window, like say we saw with Shin Snuffler or Esperance Carp again here in patch 7.4? Or is it a shorter intuition like Snowy Paraxis, where it's like 30, 35 seconds and you have 23 minutes to get as many as you can? There's that to come into play. And then finally the last, well, second to last thing is it a mooch or not? Can a fish mooch? Do you have to catch a fish in order to have a chance to in order to use that as bait to be able to catch another fish? That's very much like a binary, like is it mooch or not? And we'll get to that in a minute. But like that's something else that a fish could be or need to actually be caught. And then finally, I do want to touch on just like a few other little things too that could make a fish interesting. And I will put this all together right after this. I promise. I'm sorry I keep saying that, but it's like I'm listing out a little laundry list of stuff here, but I need to lay that foundation so we can start talking about why fish are interesting or what makes fish interesting. So the last thing that a fish, impacts a fish is its weather. How, like, what weather can it have in order to be caught, and what fish can be actually be caught in that weather at the same time, or even at that same time. We see that with Mora tecta, because hoodwinker is usually up at the same time, or is always up at the same time, which changes how you would approach that fishing hole depending on the time of day or even the weather. And there's a few examples where it's like Jaws of Undeath has a requirement of if it's cloudy or foggy after a certain weather, Jaws of Undeath will be up. But you need the Jaws of Undeath to catch Lystracanthus as a mooch, but Lystracanthus is only up during fog. So there's this weird like little interplay there of windows. Technically, even like not every Mora tecta window leads into a lancet fish window. Not even Mora tecta's fishing conditions has Mora tecta's fishing like weather isn't the same as lancet fishes, so that's why I think there's a weird like delay between the two. It's very interesting and novel. I'll get to that in a second. But really, the weather just controls the rarity of the fish, which can be interesting in itself, and we'll talk about some of those examples in a bit. So, okay, I've laid all those things out. That was like a list of like 10 different things: bait choice, the fishing hole, the bite time, the bite types in the fish, fish rarity, fish slipperiness, mooching, intuition, is it a hidden fish, the length of the window, the weather. All of these things impact what makes a fish interesting. But what combination of these actually makes it interesting? So we have all these pieces. And when it comes down to it, we see a increase, at least in my opinion, an increase in interestingness as the expansion goes on. So like when we start with patch, the 0.1 patch, we don't usually have super interesting fish. There isn't a lot of things that come into play. So when we look at all those, that big list of things that make fish interesting, you only need to pick like one or two. Usually it's like maybe it's a rare-ish weather, like an intermediately rare weather, but doesn't have a time. Maybe it has a mooch, but it's not a hard one to get. Like, maybe it's a little slippery. Those early fish aren't as interesting, in my opinion, because they don't have a lot of engagement. And the engagement is measured, and for at least how I measure engagement, by how much am I going to need to know the skills that I have been given in order to catch that fish. How much information about the fishing hole am I going to need in order to catch that fish? So early on, we're seeing fish that have very, they're standout bite types. They're the only ferocious bite in the fishing hole, or if they're not, then they are the longest bites, so they could be easily identified. Or maybe they are the only ferocious bite at that specific time. I don't need to know a lot of information about that fish in order to be able to catch it. I don't need to use a lot of skills. I'll use chum. I'll probably use slap. I will probably maybe use the lure depending on how the hole is set up. But those early fish aren't always as interesting because they don't have all these like they don't the little pieces of things that these little features of fish. They don't they don't come into play. Like we don't usually have to deal with mooches too much. Usually you don't have an intuition that early on in the expansion. Maybe they're a hidden fish. That would be fun and interesting, but typically they have longer windows, so that doesn't come into play as much. But when we get into later expansion, like later parts of the expansion, that's when the interesting fish start coming up. When we look at an actually interesting fish, a fish that I find interesting, I will look at all of those things that I've mentioned, and it'll be like, okay, this is an interesting fish because Datniotes aeroplanos is an interesting fish because it is a short window that doesn't happen very often, and because it's a hidden fish and because it's a short window, I now need to know how hidden fish work, and I need to know that if I don't see the proc message, I'm not going to get the bite. I rest, I cast back out. That then goes, okay, do I need to use chum? Which fish am I going to slap? Is there another hidden fish in the fishing hole that I need to deal with? If it isn't a hidden fish to begin with, does the hidden fish that does exist require me to slap it instead? Like we'll see that with Giga Giant Snakehead, and even technically Sunray Ray. We'll probably run into that again in patch 7.5 because we'll be getting a big fish in Eastbound Zoger, and that's an interesting fishing hole that I'll get to in a minute. But with that, Neotes aeroplanos is an interesting fish because it is a short window that is a long biting fish, which means with a handful of long biting fish, which means I need to optimize my time. And how can I do that? I need to understand how the mechanics work. I need to know, like, this is how the ambitious lure works, this is how modest lure works, and I need to be able to know, okay, cancel. If I don't get a bite, if I don't get a proc by that third ambitious lure message, I use rest, I cast back out. If I want, I can use chum to kind of speed things up a little bit in case I do get a proc, but, it doesn't really happen often enough for me to justify that, so I don't have to. Because it's also a rare fish, there puts a little bit, or a rare fish window transition, because Datniotes aeroplanos has an average of, I think, around 3 to 4 or 5 days between windows. It basically is like the Bob Goblin bass of this expansion. Because of that, there's a little bit more pressure in being a little more optimized. How can I optimize this? Like, what do I need to be doing? And looking at that. So it's an interesting fish because it has that downtime, and it requires me to also be knowing my skill set. I need to know the fishing hole. I need to know what the conditions are for catching Datniotes, and I need to be able to apply that well. But you're probably thinking, well, okay, if the length of the window makes it interesting, or the length of the downtime makes it interesting, what about fish like Cinder Surprise or Purse of Riches? I don't think Purse of Riches is interesting because I just show up, I slap, I cast out, I chum. Some people can use lure. We did some rough math on it, and by we I mean someone in the fish court did, named Loden. The rough math comes out of, as long as you slap something and just use chum, you're fine for Purse of Riches. Like it's kind of like a do it your own way. If you want to be greedy where you use lure and chum, you can, but it's not going to get you much more than if you just use chum. Like there's the chance of a bite happening is, by our current estimates, the same, roughly the same, statistically within the same thing. A fish like Cinder Surprise also has long downtime. It has an intuition. That's cool. But it's not interesting because that intuition I only ever need to trigger it once. And so I don't have to think about optimizing time. I don't have to optimize my resources. I don't have to think about, like, okay, I don't have to make on the fly judgments. Once I trigger that intuition right before the window, it's literally just brain off. And then as soon as I hear the 3 exclamation points come up, I reel it in or attempt to reel it in. I mentioned early that, when fish fish can be placed into certain like personality buckets, like really rare or slippery or some spectrum in between. And if they are rare, they're usually not slippery. And if they're slippery, they're usually not rare. Cinder Surprise is one exception to this, where it is rare and slippery. This is something that a lot of legendary fish will do, is that they will take all of these different facets of fishing, of all the different mechanics, and they'll do something in a novel way. I think that's the term that's being used a bit more often now, is that the legendary fish aren't necessarily meant to be hard or challenging or exceedingly rare or difficult, though they usually do end up being that way. Or at least, harder to get. It's not because they have to be harder to get, it's because they are novel. It is because that they are using things in a relatively, I like to think of it as like a rule breaking way. Snowy Praxis is a very good example of a fish that I think is novel and breaks some of the rules that we've had. We don't typically have intuitions in the overworld less than 1 minute. Snowy Praxis is like 35 seconds, 35 seconds. We typically also don't see legendary fish with full 23-minute windows. Snowy Praxis has that. And so you are having to optimize. You have to know the fishing hole. You have to know which bait to use. You have to know bite times. You have to know how to manage your GP, which I haven't really touched on much, but like managing your GP is a big part of what makes a fish interesting. You have to be able to manage your GP, and you need to be able to know, what do I do and how can I maximize my time? How can I make the best use of this 23 minutes when going for Snowy Praxis? Because I'm able to, I have to use, multiple skills. There's a lot of different things in there that makes it interesting, on top of the fact that it is a 23-minute legendary fish, which we don't see many of. I think I'm trying to think of a few off the top of my head. It's like Neptodragon, Drepanapsis, are the first two that come off my head. I know there's another one in there that I can't think of, but there's at least, I think, one more. But with Snowy Praxis, you're getting you have to get multiple intuitions. You have to optimize around this. You have to plan around it. And that makes Snowy Praxis an interesting fish, because it is breaking rules. It is breaking the norm of what we are seeing, and requires you to think differently about all these fish and use all these different resources to account for it. That's what makes it interesting. That's what makes it novel. For other interesting fish that aren't legendary fish, you can start looking at, say we don't have any intuitions whatsoever. Like, can you have interesting fish without intuition is probably the better question to ask. Or without a hidden, without a mooch, without it being a hidden fish, can you have it? And the answer is yes. Aelid Scan is a relatively straightforward fish, but it is interesting in the sense that it is only 90 seconds. It is a quick bite, so you can use lures now to reroll, otherwise you didn't. You'd have to cancel early and cast back out. You had to apply knowledge of that fishing hole in order to maximize your time. Usually whenever, I get this maybe once a month or so on the Aelid Scan guides of, hey, I was catching this and I got a ferocious bite and it was the Sound of Fury. And unless you're using like the new reroll method, you should never see the Sound of Fury. So that tells me, it's like, okay, you need to know about the fish in the fishing hole a little bit more. So Aelid Scan is kind of interesting, but to that degree, Fingers, who is also another 90-second fish, and that's from A Realm Reborn, caught in Crescent Cove, is also interesting for similar reasons. It isn't necessarily because I have to use reroll, but because it is a short window. It's up every day, Eorzea time at least, so every hour or so. Fingers is a bit more interesting because it has a fishing hole that has a lot of different powerful bites. I have to know, it's like, okay, if I don't have a bite by now, do I need to wait? Do I need to reroll? Should I be using ambitious lure stacking? Should I be using that more often or not? Like, what's my slap? There's a lot of different things there that you can use to make it a little bit more interesting. Now, is fingers the most interesting fish? No, but it is, in my opinion, an interesting fish because it is such a short window. It was the first 30-second or 30-minute, 90-second window, um, and in my mind, that's is what makes it interesting. So we kind of have a variety of different examples of interesting fish there, but a lot of those are mechanics. I do want to mention that there are other things that can make a fish interesting without necessarily making it like stand out interesting. In my opinion, a fish can be interesting not only mechanically, though that and this is kind of what I measure. This is kind of like the rating for interesting that I use more is like mechanically how much am I engaged, how much knowledge do I need to apply, how much skill needs to be used in order to catch this fish. But off to the side, there's another like side metric of interesting that I follow, and that's more of the flavor of the fish. What type of fish am I catching? Basking shark caught off Mook Oogle Island is, in my opinion, kind of an interesting fish because it's a basking shark. If you haven't seen one of those, go ahead and Google that. Flying through the sky, and it's the largest fish that can be caught in the sky. Like that is a record size fish for you if you catch the max size of it, or even close to the max size of it. Uh, and you're catching like this massive, like 20, 30 foot basking shark or however long it is in the sky off an island the shape of a Moogle head. Like that's just wild. When you tell that to anybody, they're just like, oh, okay. They tilt their head a little bit. Uh, Being able to fish in these wild and weird areas is another just side layer of like flavor interest. Halo, Morn, Westmorn, Annex Old, all of those play like the whole Annex area in Dravania is a volcano, and you're fishing a volcano, and the largest fish in the game is caught in Halo in the boiling caldera of this volcano. That's kind of interesting to me. It just from a flavor perspective, Problematicus is the largest fish in the game with a size well over 1,000 inches. It's like what's that, 80 some odd feet, something like that, a little over 80 feet in imperial units. Um, that's kind of interesting to me. Is these different fishing locations of it's maybe the fish is kind of boring, but I'm fishing into a volcano. That's got to count for a little bit of something in my book. And then finally, the lore around the fish. I think this isn't looked at very often, but and I've talked about fish lore extensively in other videos, but there is some interesting information about fish that you can get out of their guide. I think one of the ones that I like highlighting is Found Meek and Found Alm caught in Ultima Thule, and you catch them in this shallow puddle of aether chemical goop in Ultima Thule there in the first area when you just arrive, and you look at it, it's like ankle deep water, if maybe shins at most. And then you catch a Found Meek or a Found Alm, and you see the size of it, and they're like 20, 30, 40 foot wingspan of these manta rays. And you're like, there is no way I can catch that in this. And at first you're like, well, that doesn't make any sense. Like, oh, that's just being a game. It's a little immersion breaking. But what's interesting is if you read their guide, their like log entry, the game explains how you catch them. And Found Meek and Found Alm are actually birds from the Dragon Star brought into Ultima Thule. And you don't pull them out of the water. They're not swimming around in the water. They're flying around in the air. And you just don't see them because I guess that would have, ruined immersion or something. I don't know. But hand waves, there's these birds flying around. And you catch them when they swoop down into the water to eat your bait. And then you reel them in, not from the water, but as they fly away from into the sky. You're catching birds, basically. And that kind of makes it interesting. I mean, that I think that's really fun. Like I should say the most interesting fish is going for me is going to be something that requires me to be engaged. Not and you're like, wow, this was the whole build up was wow, you just want to say interesting fish are engaging fish. Yeah, duh. But it's not just that they're engaging because players tend to when they don't know much about fishing in Final Fantasy 14 they tend to assume that fishing is a lot like other MMOs or other RPGs where it's a side thing. And technically fishing is still a side thing, but because it's a side thing, it isn't deep. There isn't lore there. I don't need to think about what I'm doing. I just have to cast out with the right bait and hope for the best. Like it's all RNG. There isn't all RNG. There is skill. There is skill involved with fishing. There is knowledge that you need to acquire. There is application of all of that and skill expression that you have to deal with. And that on its own can make a fish interesting, but then you add in that flavor interest of, what type of fish are you catching? Am I reeling a crocodile out of a moat somewhere? That's kind of cool. Am I catching a uh, a book turned into a fish because the Fae were having a joke with this guy? That could be interesting, and that just adds layers to that level of interest and flavor of what can make a fish interesting. So when you come into fishing and you don't expect that, it can be a little shocking. And I think being able to have a bit of a heads up, like, hey, yeah, fishing is a little different. And here's what makes it interesting, can help. But I also think that seeing more engaging fish, not only in engaging in world building, but more so engaging with the skills and what we have, can be really the big definer of an interesting fish. And obviously we can't have every fish be interesting. If every fish was punity pain, no one would fish. I think if every fish was as involved as punity pain or had the same downtime as Aelidscon or same window length as Snowy Paraxis, like no one, that would get boring and or it would get tiring because you'd have to be constantly thinking about like, what do you want to do, how do you want to approach this fish. Like you'd be spending 23 minutes, it'd be like doing an ultimate of for 2 hours, except instead of at the end of it, instead of getting a weapon, you get just a fish that you probably can't do anything with. Um, you you have to have the royal you. I'm not really speaking to anyone in particular, but you have to have a breadth, like a spectrum of these fish. You need to have boring fish. You need to have interesting fish, but you need to have a balance. And while I would love to see interesting fish, you can have intricate, engaged, interesting fish, but you can also make those fish that aren't mechanically interesting still interesting with their flavor, with where they're caught, with how they're caught, um, with the lore and the stories behind them as well. The most perfect, interesting fish is going to be something that isn't like Punity Pain and isn't something like Found Meek, but somewhere right in the middle where it requires, me to use most of my skills. It requires me to have some understanding of a fish, but it also is something that gives me a good story, a good piece of information about the world or the fish or the area around where I'm fishing. So that one, that was kind of a rough idea or a rough conversation on what makes a fish interesting. It's I wrote up the notes for this, and it was very clear cut. It was like, oh yeah, these are all the things that make a fish interesting. And then when you really start talking about it, like it really is just like, here's a laundry list of things that could change. Let's talk about how they interact with each other. So I apologize for that at the beginning, but I did want to again lay out that foundation of here's everything that it could be. Here's everything that a fish can be, or a fish can manipulate to kind of illustrate that fishing isn't just, or at least fish, excuse me, fish aren't just these little like things that exist in the game that you just go and get and come back. There is actual design aspects for them all. And there are fish that have good designs, like Stethocanthus, Punity Pain, um, Ruby Dragon to a degree. I even think fish like Bobgoblin Bass and Takatoa are all very good, and they're not challenging fish. Not all of them. Some of them are. Um, but that's a thing. Like that, there is a thing for that. With uninteresting fish, like those exist. Poorly designed fish, Cinder Surprise, boring fish. Not because it's a pain to catch, because it's rare and it's slippery and it has bad downtime. That isn't the reason why I think it's poorly designed. I just think it's not interesting. There's no, you get the intuition and that's it. You're done. Um, so yeah, so I hope that does help give you a little bit more insight into when I'm talking about like interesting fish, or maybe helps you think about the fish you're going for as well. Like, which type of fish do you like to catch? Which one, like, which fish are interesting for you? Because it's going to be different for everybody. And I would love to hear what fish you find interesting. But until next time, thank you for listening to this ramble. It was definitely more rambly than the others, but thank you. Good luck and happy fishing.